Hello, class. Welcome to Preview Lesson 2-10. This is to have been viewed, and you are to take notes on this prior to our actual Lesson 2-10. That's the 10th week of the second semester, of course. But it has to do with the life of Paul. We're entering into that section of the Bible that talks a lot about what really Paul has to say regarding belief and behavior concerning being a follower of Jesus. And we see this written through his 13 letters. And so we're just going to begin with Romans, of course, in class. But before we even delve into Romans or in any of the other letters, here are some just overview facts about Paul's life that I want to highlight. And so I'm pulling up a PowerPoint right now that I want you to, again, take notes on. And as you can see, the title, of course, as it says, is an overview of Paul's life. That's the section title. And just a few things that I do want to highlight. This is by no means an exhaustive explanation of his life, but here are some key elements that need to be noted. First of all, we know he lived from 6 A.D. to 67 A.D. And in fact, we know died under the rule of the Emperor Nero, very famous or rather infamous emperor of the Roman Empire. He was born in an official Roman city called Tarsus. He was referred to, in fact, as Saul of Tarsus. And because of being born there, he was, as a result, a Roman citizen. That's important to understand as well about Paul's identity. Thirdly, he was also, in addition to being politically a Roman citizen, he was ethnically a Jew. Deeply influenced by the Old Testament, of course. They didn't refer to it as the Old Testament. It was simply the Word of God, or the Torah, more accurately. And he studied in Jerusalem, actually, under one of the leading rabbis and teachers of that time, Gamaliel. And Paul was apparently an extraordinary student. He decided to become a Pharisee, which was a group of religious teachers and religious leaders in Israel that sought more than anything to renew their faithfulness to the law of Moses. And they felt that what the Jews needed more than anything else was, quite frankly, revival. That was their heart. That was their desire. So it was adherence to the law of Moses that trumped everything else. As a result, many of the Pharisees, and most, in fact, only a few privately, were in favor of Christianity. So most opposed Christianity, and none did it more vehemently than Paul did, or Saul, as we should call him at this point in his life. That was his given name. And he, in fact, saw Jesus basically as an imposter, as a fake Messiah. And he thought that all of the Christians that followed this Jesus Christ, little Christians, little Christs, that's what Christian means, that they were deluded, that they were being misled by this outrageous imposter named Jesus. Of course, you know the story of Saul, who became Paul, because when he was on his way eventually to Damascus, something happened. But again, back to the whole idea of how educated he was. He happened to speak at least 3 different languages, possibly a 4th, Latin, but he definitely spoke Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And there's a great instance, in fact, in the book of Acts where he speaks in various languages, and it kind of silences the people. Now, speaking of that conversion that he had to Christianity, it happened while he was en route to the town of Damascus with a letter authorizing him to imprison Christians, including their families, and even put them to death. And he had been already in favor of that, as the scriptures account for his presence at the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. But on his way to Damascus, we know that he was struck down by this great light, and a voice from the heavens spoke to him, and that was the voice of Jesus. And we see that detailed for us in Acts chapter 9. And so you can go back to Acts and look at that to see exactly how that unfolded and all that Paul went through, or Saul, again, at that time, went through as he was literally he had his whole world turned upside down. And this happened around the year 33 AD. Some of you may be wondering, well, didn't Jesus get crucified that very same year? Well, actually, the calendar that we use to date to the birth of Christ is, by our best estimate, a few years off. We think Jesus was actually born a few years before 0, as it were, AD, and he was born BC. A few years. So that's why. So this is basically a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus and his ascension to heaven. Lastly, I want to highlight the fact that when he was ready to continue following this new road, where his whole life was changed and became a follower of Jesus, he began his missionary journeys and spreading the gospel, the good news about Jesus. And he did this around the late 40s AD. So he took some time kind of preparing himself and getting acclimated really to the Christian community, because many of them were suspicious of him. Who is this guy that used to persecute us and now he's one of us? Many were doubtful, were skeptical. And so it took some time. There was also, again, as I said, some preparation that Saul to Paul that he himself went through. And so it took some time before he went from his conversion to the point where he was ready to embark on some missionary work as Jesus was sending him to, as the church commissioned him to. So let's talk about those missionary journeys of his, because that's especially important to understanding not just who Paul is, but the work of the Lord, and also what happened in the context of all of the letters that he wrote that we have as part of the New Testament. And so I want to talk about the link between his missionary work and his missionary writings, really. And I call them missionary writings for a very specific purpose. And it's simply because of this point. His writings sprung from his missionary work. His desire, more than anything, was to disciple the new believers that were growing in these newly planted, newly developed churches. Okay, so he had a heart for, just as he was adamant and zealous about persecuting Christians, he was just as adamant and just as zealous, if not more so, in spreading this very gospel, this Christianity that he now embraced. And so he had a heart for these people, and you can see his heart on display in a number of ways in the way he writes his various letters. He feels deeply. He's a passionate person. But I want to go over those journeys that he embarks on, because some of these journeys will help us understand when he wrote certain books of the Bible, certain letters, or as we call them, epistles. These extended instructional letters is what they are. So his first journey took place around 47 to 49 AD. Okay, so it's about a 3-year period. And he traveled from the region of Antioch, you can see here on the map. And by the way, this is the coastline of, now it says Syria there. That is where modern day Syria is, but there was also an ancient country of Syria as well. This is the region of Asia Minor. And the region that he spent the most time in, this is modern day Turkey, is Galatia. Galatia, that's what these churches are all about. And so, yeah, when you think of the letter to the Galatians, that is addressing all of these churches in this region. So he starts here in Antioch. He goes by way of this island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. By the way, you might wonder where Israel is, where Palestine is. It's down here. And he travels all the way through here to the port city there, and he sees, you can see him there at at Perga, and then he travels all the way up into Antioch, and we see him traveling to Iconium, to Lystra, to Derbe, and then he kind of does a return route and comes a slightly different way back to Antioch, a more direct way from the port city here all the way over to Seleucus. So actually Seleucus is where he started and ended. So Antioch was further inland. So that was his first journey. Again, 3 years we're talking. And then we come to his second journey. His second journey took place shortly after his first journey concluded, and this took place also over the course of 3, maybe 4 years, from 50 to 53 AD. You see that C right in front of the years? That means circa. That's short for circa, meaning about the time of. We're not precisely sure. It's not like we have a detailed itinerary, but based on other events that he's referring to and just other evidence that we have, these are the best guesses, they're educated guesses as to when he took these journeys. But this time, instead of being with Barnabas, he's with Silas and Timothy. Timothy, who's someone he's mentoring, he's a young pastor, and he is taking this journey to Philippi, to Berea, to Thessalonica, and also to Corinth. And it's also during this journey that he writes the Thessalonian letters. First and Second Thessalonians, and those are pretty significant letters. They even address some end times issues, as does the book of Revelation. But here's where it takes place. And feel free to pause the video to go back if you didn't copy all of these items here. But you can see that his journey started in Jerusalem. Jerusalem sent him off. He goes up by way of Antioch, and then he travels all through Asia Minor. And now he goes into the region of what is Macedonia. And then he gets into Greece proper. And he spends a good bit of time in this region. You can see this is where he visits Thessalonica, right? He's at Troas, Neapolis, Philippi, Berea, Thessalonica, down to Athens and Corinth. And you can see Centuria. And then he travels back across the Aegean to Ephesus, and then all the way back to Jerusalem. That's his second journey. Now, that's a lot of traveling, either on foot, on boat. So he's a busy guy. He's putting on a lot of miles. His third journey takes place right on the heels of his second. And this is also just as long, from 53 to 57 AD, about 4 years in length. But he spends a huge portion, probably half of that time, he spends in Ephesus. And then he goes back over to Macedonia in that map. And it's during this time, probably, I'm trying to think, we're not exactly sure where he is, but it's during this time period, anywhere during the 4-year time period. He writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then he also writes Romans, and which is significant because we are now going to be studying Romans in class right on the heels of this video lesson. So that's important to understand in terms of time frame. So this is towards the end of his missionary work. It's possible he took a 4th journey, but we know for sure he took these 3. More about that 4th one in a moment. But check out this map. This shows you his, again, path that he took. He starts this time in Antioch, and he goes through Asia Minor. And this is where he spends most of his time, Ephesus. But then he makes his way up the coastline here of the Aegean, and he spends a good bit of time in Macedonia, goes down to Corinth, back up through this way, and then he sails back from Thessalonica through the Aegean, down this way through the Mediterranean, back to Tyre and Ptolemais and Caesarea, and then he ends up in Jerusalem. And that's significant. The fact that he ends up in Jerusalem is significant. Why? Because of this next point. And if you track his story, as of course the second half of Acts does, as we've learned in class this past week, you know that it is in Jerusalem that he gets arrested. And then he is imprisoned and sent to Caesarea Maritima, which means it's on the coast. And then eventually he goes to Rome. The reason he goes to Rome is because he appeals to Caesar, because he's a Roman citizen. He wants his case heard by Caesar. But the Jewish officials are still trying to imprison him, but he's actually are trying to put him to death. But it is not the Jews that are holding him prisoner. It is the Romans that are holding him prisoner. And so eventually he makes his way to Rome, and he writes the letters of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And we refer to these books as prison letters because we know he wrote them in prison. And he also often will talk about being in chains for Christ. So, about that 4th journey. It's possible that while he was in Rome, while under house arrest, he was given a lot of leeway. And we think that he was able to even travel, even though he was based in Rome. We think that he took possibly a 4th journey that took him as far west as Spain, and then he would come back into the Aegean area where a lot of the churches that he had planted and that he had already written letters to were located. But that is essentially an overview of his missionary journeys and his writings. But don't forget this initial point up here, that all of his writings sprung from these journeys, this missionary work, because he had a heart for these new believers in these various churches. He knew that they were facing challenges. They were facing outright persecution. They were facing all kinds of temptations. There were church divisions as a result. I mean, basically, a lot of the problems that the church has faced for the last 2,000 years were faced by these churches. And Paul addresses a lot of them. And so these are practical writings that can be very helpful for how we can live out our faith today. Now, in terms of those writings, the topics that he covered, I mean, we're talking, he covered all kinds of things. He was a big one for essential teachings about who God is. Remember, most ancients embraced what's called polytheism, that there were many gods. But Paul was adamant, and this comes out most clearly, especially in his speech in Athens at the Areopagus, where he says, hey, there is only one God, the creator of everything. He is central to everything. He also addresses the issue of the topic of evil and underscoring the fact that it is orchestrated by Satan. Satan is behind it. And paying attention to the fact that there is a spiritual battle going on. He also talks about the role of the Mosaic law. He was a Jew. He took the law very seriously, the Ten Commandments. What was the purpose of the law? It was to point the way to the kind of life we're meant to live, but realizing that no one by their own strength is able to live that kind of life. And all of us fall short of the glory of God, as he writes in Romans itself. And so the law reveals our sinfulness, our shortcomings. And people can misuse the law even and into it being used as a legalistic way of just simply following these rules and regulations as a way to get God to love you. But of course, that isn't the way at all of the gospel. Then other topics that are addressed are what does it mean to be part of the church, the people of God? What is the nature of the scriptures and revelation, and who is the Messiah? Of course, he has a lot to say about Jesus and our redemption in him, and the importance and the centrality of the sacrifice on the cross, and also the hope we have because Jesus didn't stay dead. He didn't just die for our sins. He rose again, and the resurrection, and also proper behavior, ethics, and also the end times also addressed. But here's the underlying, or I guess I should say, the summary statement of Paul's writings and his work, and why Paul is such a significant figure in the Bible and in our own, as it were, family history as Christians in the church. The significance of Paul's missionary work and his missionary writings is this. Paul, in so many ways, parallels and complements the ongoing work of Christ. He really does. And what he does is he leads the church into its greatest chapter of early growth. And he shepherds the church all throughout the Mediterranean region through his letters, through his visits, and through those he mentors, the Timothys of the day, and many others that we don't have time to name. But Paul's mission is significant. And so I'm looking forward to us talking more about what he has to say, especially in the book of Romans.